Hello, welcome to your Daily Fix by Atieno Nyarkasagam. We need new power, not new leaders. Bwana Fred Swaniker. This episode is a critical take on this very prevalent protocol advanced by entrepreneurs like Fred Swaniker, the founder of the African Leadership Academy and African Leadership Network, and very soon the African Leadership University. He is the founder of a school to which I attended. African Leadership Academy was my alma mater. I was part of the inaugural class that attended the school between 2008 and 2010. As I speak, I am a university graduate. I studied political philosophy at Michigan State University and a specialization in African studies. My interest in discourses about Africa are enduring and relentless. And for a background of my continued inquisition and critical analysis on some of the institutions that are pushing toward African Renaissance and focusing on youth, you can look at abego.wordpress.com. That's abegoh.wordpress.com, where I spoke and wrote about the various experiences at the African Leadership Academy in South Africa, and picked out specific issues with the paradigm, the ethos that underpinned the programming of the Africana curriculum and the leadership series and so on and so forth. For today's piece, however, I am trying to respond to something that has been very dominant in Fred's discourses about Africana Renaissance and his mission for developing the next generation of African leaders, which in itself is a noble idea. And it's a nice thing to do. You know, it's nothing bad to bring in youth and educate them and prepare them, you know, to be able to be in a position to best take advantage of the challenges and opportunities that they have, and there's nothing wrong with that. And most of all, for me, the most powerful thing was just the connection with Africans from different parts of the continent, because I had not had that kind of exposure. And one thing that you will hear is that many of us Africans in the continent don't tend to have, you know, real tangible experiences, interconnections with other Africans from the continent, with the exception of those in neighboring countries, of course. So that was amazing, and you know, these friendships that we have made and the kinds of connections that we made and make by extension of, you know, by being part of the alumni will continue to blossom throughout our lives. And for that, of course, you know, we are grateful. But our gratitude must not stand in the way of our ability to think and reflect and question everything. And indeed, it was ALA that really empowered us to question, to think, to reason, you know, and to be able to push the discourses. And that is why, you know, for me, you know, it is so important. You know, it's something I just cannot let go for whatever reason. And I saw this TED Talk that Fred gave in October, I believe, in Brazil, where Fred was explaining, and I have a huge critical take on this analysis that Africa's greatest problem is bad leaders. And he explained that in a place like Africa where they are weak systems, weak structures, weak institutions. The leadership is the most foundational thing. And he went on to categorize 4 classes of African leaders. And he started his analysis from the independence era leaders. And he started basically the founding fathers of modern African nations, the likes of Julius Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta, even Robert Mugabe was part of that class. And then he categorized a second wave after that. In Kenya, for example, that would be President Moi. And then he categorized another third class, between the 60s and the 70s, 70s and 80s, 80s and 90s, and to date. And basically what he was saying were the first class, the Kwame Nkrumahs. Those were very visionary leaders, and they set us off to a very high place. And then the second wave of leaders began to mess around, and the third phase really tanked us, the Mugabes, and the fourth leaders. And he cited Paul Kagame as an example of a leader who, has led to some sort of stabilization. And indeed he has, looking at the post-Rwanda genocide. And he gave this analysis that the next couple of decades, the products of these African Renaissance institutions, such as the ones he has begun, the African Leadership Academy, the Leadership Network, and the university, are the generation of leaders in the continent who were going to be Africa's finest. And I had a million problems with that. So many problems with that analysis. And 2 years ago, on my blog, abego.wordpress.com, I did question this ethos. And my questioning has fleshed out and grown a bit more complex, but I will start with the basics, which is rooted in a very African-loving perspective, an African truth-seeking perspective. And this is the fact that it is very problematic to reduce Africa's problem in such a prominent forum, as such a prominent person, Mr. Swaniker, to reduce Africa's problem to bad leaders, and to even use the language of bad leaders is very problematic and takes roots in colonialism, colonial times. And the reason I say this is two reasons. In contemporary analysis of Western government and effectiveness, we never use the language, media never uses the language of quote-unquote bad leaders. We may talk about leaders whose policies have failed or are ineffective. We may talk about leaders who are compromised, but we never simply use this black and white system of assessing leaders bad or good. That is a certain kind of moral judgment. Instead, we tend, when we're thinking about leaders who are not of African descent, we assess them by the quality of their work and use that kind of higher level of analysis. So when Africans were mobilizing for independence, a lot of the language that the former colonial masters were using was that we cannot give Africans the reins on their own nations because Africans cannot lead themselves. They're incompetent. They are by their nature incompetent, incapable of leading countries. And when we continue to use the language of bad leader, we suggest they're inherently bad. Yeah? And even for leaders who may have, taken up policies or, taken up actions that have been problematic. Let's take Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe, with all of his faults, his clinging into power, his massive corruption, his abuse of human rights, and all of the like. Robert Mugabe, if we were to trace his political history, we know that he was a freedom fighter in Zimbabwe. And we know that during the premier years of his rule, he was loved and lauded all over Zimbabwe. Again, I generalize. But his coming into leadership wasn't in and of itself problematic. And his initial years of governance were, by any, reasonable standards, was pretty good. The question we need to ask not is Robert Mugabe a bad leader, but what happened so that Robert Mugabe's political ideology changed so that he began to be very intolerant, or he began to amass, inordinate amounts of power, and use, use various tactics to bring other political leaders and masses to follow him and allow him to turn what would have been a democratic nation into a monarchy. Essentially, a monarchy where he had free reign of the resources of the country, the power, the freedoms, And when we begin to analyze things like that, we allow ourselves to assess, the steps, and to be very conscious about how, to be very, first of all, to be aware that humans are fallible. Humans are fallible, even those who rise, on the backs of the nation. Look at the late President Jomo Kenyatta too, was a champion at the independence era, and his history today is tainted, of course, by the revelations of his abuse of human rights, his theft of national property. And do we call him a bad leader? I would hesitate to do so based on the reasons I gave, but I will definitely say he did commit various kinds of political fraud and human rights violations, indeed. And he did do a bunch of other, excellent developmental things within the country, including mobilizing, advocating, and of course, guiding the country from colonization to independence. How do we look at these leaders and their stories in a way that does not deny them their right and deny our countries, the good things that they did do, and does not pretend that these leaders did not take, decisions that were, detrimental to some individuals personally and to our nationhood altogether. So the notion that Africa has produced bad leaders is an insult also to the generation of leaders like Patrice Lumumba, who came into power at Congo's independence as prime minister, but was assassinated by the hand of the United States under President Eisenhower, and French troops, I believe also the Belgians, had something to do with that. How do we rationalize the death, the murder, the assassination of great leaders like Samora Machel in Mozambique, like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso? When you begin to defy the history of, this growth from colonial leadership into this whole post-colonial leadership by slamming our leaders as bad leaders, you undo so much, and you fail to recognize the other forces that these leaders were competing with while they tried to, leaders and people, because these leaders were working under the commission of the masses in most cases. And there were teams of leaders, And these presidential figures and prime ministerial figures were themselves agents, but indeed they were representative forces of greater parliaments and committees of leaders working in different capacities to move these countries and to develop systems that would work. But what happened? When you look at African history, you'll see that there are various things that happened. In some countries, there was a lot of pressure, enduring pressure from former colonial masters, so that the former masters maintained a lot of domination over economic system, financial system, and even just, the kinds of leaders that would come into power. In other situations, yeah, you find that, like, for example, what happened in the Congo, when the Belgians left and they tore apart the whole system and they took away all of the infrastructure. And it became painstakingly difficult to start in a country where there was barely, anybody highly educated enough to manage this country effectively and to delegate this power to manage the kinds of resources. I was very disappointed. I'm very disappointed with the language of bad leaders at the root of Africa's problem. We, the people in these countries, many of the times, we are the ones who birth these people. We are the ones who educate these people. We are the ones who elect these people. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves, what kind of collective personhood, what kind of societies do we have, and what are the kinds of forces that are influencing us within society, so that, to come into power, like in Uganda, think about Museveni, to be able to enforce the kinds of, let's say the moral code laws in Uganda that really regulate how women's bodies and men's bodies can manifest in public by checking on the length of clothes that you can wear, for example, the ways in which you can display affection between people in a relationship, and more problematic is the kinds of laws that ban against identification as a lesbian or a gay or a bisexual, transsexual person, and even relating and having being in a relationship or marrying. When people are born into these kinds of societies, they take on these kinds of beliefs, these kinds of cultures, and ways of thinking. And if we were to ask ourselves, where do a lot of these things come from? One of the biggest and most powerful influences in contemporary African social thought is Christianity. And the thing about Christianity in many of these supposedly secular African nations, besides, of course, being a tool in itself of colonization, is that Christian moral codes are not just read directly from Bible, but are doctored and propagated in altered forms by leaders of congregations. And the Christian doctrine and culture is then transposed as national culture. And traditional, and I quote unquote, traditional African culture is misread. People stand in defense of a lot of things, saying a lot of problematic, sometimes many times oppressive things, saying it is our African culture, or it is against our African culture, using that language, which is also problematic because what's happening is that people, one, have turned the notion of African culture into a monolith, and deploy the language of African culture where it suits them, in spite of the fact that, one, there was so much diversity over different periods of time. So what point do you start checking African culture? Secondly, there were so many different kinds and opposing notions of rightness or wrongness or morality across different ethnic nations, even adjacent to each other. So which one do you choose? And third, just a simple lie. People just use African culture in defense, in their own defense, as they partake in actions that are essentially oppressive, like the abuse of women, misogyny, patriarchy in Kenya, in Uganda, and other parts of the continent. Now, where I am right now, I have had the opportunity to explore the question of power, and to gain a better understanding of different people's notions about who truly has the power. Because, for example, like if you were to take Kenya, and you're talking about how do we transform this country, to be honest, I have very little confidence in the ability of transposing our political landscape by just getting ordinary folks, or even specially educated people, to come into government. Because the way things really do operate is that there are certain people in the country who have power. And a lot of the times, this power is decades of accumulated wealth. A lot of this is a product, even globally, of this unequal and many times corrupt accumulation of wealth. And these wealthy dynasties, with these wealthy classes, these guys have the power. So change cannot occur by trying to occupy the seats that these people in power have. Because even if I, for example, were to go into government, now let me give an example of Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of Kenya. Kenyatta's family is very likely the wealthiest family in Kenya, and they own very much of the country's land. A lot of this, according to various activists and non-sanctioned texts, was accumulated illegally or fraudulently, or using the force of the late Jomo Kenyatta. Now, take someone like President Moi. There are a lot of these political dynasties, very rich families, whose interests are very well protected and vested in the kinds of leaders who come into play. And to turn the wave of this kind of influence, because when they have that much money, what they can easily, they can make it impossible for you to do anything, to access to wealth, or simply sabotaging by being able to pay off, rowdy hooligans. Boniface is an activist in Kenya who organized a march against Parliament, and actually it was at the office of the president. And this protest demonstration was to bring attention to the fact that as citizens, we are of the terrible state of insecurity in our country, and insecurity locally, incidences of violent crime, but also from terrorist groups, and I guess that was mostly the cause, the terrorist groups in Somalia, in Al-Shabaab. And the Boniface explained, because he found this out, yeah, the office of the president, the office of Uhuru Kenyatta, had organized and paid off a crowd of young men, disrupt the protest, to make it to protest peacefully, and to stab Boniface and to harass him so much that he would not do that, and also to, of course, to discourage others from trying the thing. And this is from the office of the president. And the reason how he knew this was from the office of the president, I will show a video clip of Boniface here. You can click onto the link that I will place on the screen. And he knew this because he was able to get an interview privately with one of the guys who was leading the crowd of hooligans, who then confessed to him who had paid them off and why there was, so much, why they decided to turn the president's office in, because they never got as much money as they were promised. And the reason why I cite this is that there are existing movements of revolutionary leaders, but there are set powers, sometimes in the form of government, sometimes in the form of just, rich people who will make it impossible to overturn things. And the truth is that what the focus needs to be, like, like this is a kind of conversation a lot in the US among activist circle. It's about the power bases. Where is the power? In the US, for example, the power is in the financial institutions, the banks, and so on, and the corporate sector. The government is tightly persuaded here in the US, for example, by heavily persuaded and bought, quite frankly, by government interests, and that is why it is very difficult, to push so-called common sense laws, for example, like, against, this climate change and things like GMO labeling, for example. Very, very common sense. So when you start to move yourself from this whole notion of producing top-down change, and you want to subvert this power system, I propose that the intention, that the energy should look into bottom-up change. And what do I mean by bottom-up change? By shaking the power system. I watched a TED video that was talking about how the internet, various applications, and just generally the internet, has subverted, and it continues to subvert in many ways, the power system. And I'll put a link right here for you to watch. And giving examples of applications like the Airbnb, Lyft, various kinds of, like, for example, this here right here, Google Plus. The fact that I can broadcast this live, I can have my own, TV show, I can have my own radio podcasting situation. I do not depend on employment in, in existence establishments. Yeah. Give me just 1 second. This baby's working. Everybody's here. Okay. So good. what the internet is doing, for example, is that it's giving many people who did not have power, representative power, um, representational power, for example, like what I'm doing. It's giving us power that we will not otherwise have had. I do not need to be part of, MSNBC or CBC. I do not need to aspire to work at CNN or to work at Forbes anymore to be a journalist who's successful. And what it does is that it allows us, for example, to, to have the opportunity to reach masses of people without having go-betweens, right? Mhm. So when it does this, it means that we are less susceptible, for example, to single stories, but in countries, for example, that may be transmitted by national media stations or national syndicated newspapers, even globally. We need not complain till eternity about the single story about Africa as portrayed in the media, because we now have an opportunity cheaply and almost freely to form a different kind of media. We are transcending all forms of media where you relied on specific mainstream outlets. But now you can watch what you want to watch. The ways in which we acquire news has changed. We acquire news, we acquire analysis on issues from our friends on Facebook or on Twitter, you know. And when you think about it on a larger scale, for those, of course, who might not have access to the internet, what does this movement of power look like? I'll go back to the case of Boniface in Kenya, the activist whose protest was ruined simply by uh, the president's paid hooligans, and talk about those hooligans, quote unquote, but they deserve the name hooligans for what they did, not because of who they were. Poverty is a very, very, very real thing, and poverty is very central to this analysis, because when you have people who can be bought, you know, over by, maybe 200 shillings, that's $2, or 500 shillings, that's $5, to go and, disturb a protest that is in their interest and that was doing no harm to them. You have to ask yourself, you know, and you have to be honest, because the only way in which we can mediate this kind of situation, in a situation that would occur, for example, like when you have an election and you have hooligans hired to bring chaos and to threaten viable um, viable candidates. You have to ask yourself um, about the centrality of poverty and the lack of wealth and the domination of wealth by other people. If we were to shift this and assume that people people cannot be bought against their interest by $2, these are people. It's not about a middle class. It's about everybody in maximizing as far as possible that within a society people are paid livable wages, or people are able to generate as much of their living needs as possible. That means basic food, they have a place to stay, they have a means to affordable energy, as electricity or fuel for, for food, for burning, fuel for lighting their stoves or things like that. And to move power back to the masses in a continent that is ravaged by poverty means to find ways, first and foremost, to give as many of these people, the tools to develop and to live within a space where they are able to meet their needs, the needs of their family comfortably enough that they are able to think rationally about their interests, and they're able to have desires that transcend their day-to-day hustle. The African Renaissance project is very isolationist because not too many people, one, are defined by this category of leaders, and not too many people even have, honestly, who has the time to worry about political changes and all of those kinds of high-level conversations when you're struggling to find gas to cook your food, or struggling to afford to pay rent. And that's what many people, I think most people are struggling like that. And I'm more conscious about this because I live in Detroit, and we are technically, my family, we live technically under the poverty line. And while I can sincerely say that we don't have it that bad, we don't have it bad at all, but you know, you become very close to these kinds of real struggles when, well, for you wait till the last possible day to turn the heat on in the winter because it's too expensive to heat your house, rationing food, worrying about water bills and your water, running illegal water in your home. We have not even turned on our water legally. I think I've gone on and on too much there and I've just lost it. But yeah, I think we need to question about this, Let's question, let's stop simplifying this narrative. It's copying out. Because the truth is, I gave up on trying to be an African, a revolutionary in the way that I thought I wanted to, where I'm going to mobilize and give my life for people. No, I'm not giving my life for people because those people will be the first in line to kill me if need be, because it is rough. They will be first in line to partake in that hijacking, that carjacking, that robbery, Yeah. All right. Well, you will listen to Daily Faith to the channel. I'll do a follow up on this in a minute. Thank you.